My name is Benton Stokes. I'm a former fundamentalist, post-evangelical worship leader, and songwriter. I enjoy wry Manhattans, roller coasters, and road trips, just not all at the same time.
I'm Elaine O'Rourke, and I'm a teacher, an author, and a spiritual coach. I was a philosophy professor and a liberal pastor in a couple of former lives, and these days, I love aha moments and not-so-dry martinis.
We have conversations about life and God with a queer perspective, over cocktails, like you. This is Cocktail Theology. Today's cocktail is a Collins.
What the heck is a Collins?
A Collins. Have you ever heard of a Tom Collins?
I have. I thought he was like a peeping Tom.
I hope he wasn't.
No? Okay. Sorry.
So Collins kind of refers to a class of cocktails that generally includes gin, lemon, and sugar. And
Okay.
it's topped with something fizzy.
Okay.
So, and it's served in a tall, skinny glass.
Okay.
Which,
AKA a Collins glass?
A Collins glass, right.
Okay.
There have been many variations on Collinses over the years.
Okay.
The variation that we're going to enjoy today is a Limoncello Collins.
Okay.
Because limoncello is already really sweet, there's no added sugar here, so it's going to be limoncello, which is a lemon-flavored Italian liqueur. Mm-hmm. It's gin, and then I used Topo Chico, which is a favorite of ours. It's mineral water. It's dry and very bright and sparkly from Mexico, and then it gets a mint sprig.
So I'm essentially squishing the mint sprig, and I'm going to push it into the Collins, because I love mint, as you know.
I do too. So it's very lemony and fresh.
It is. Very light.
Yeah.
Okay.
Light.
The gin is not prominent.
It's proportionately less than the limoncello. The limoncello kind of carries the drink.
Okay. Yeah, you could drink a lot of those on a hot day.
Yeah. The other thing about a Collins is that typically they aren't super high in alcohol content.
Okay.
So they are sort of meant to be kind of a afternoon by the pool kind of sipper. Right?
Okay.
And because it's a nice summer day, I thought it'd be nice to have a nice summer drink.
I like that. So this is really kind of the opposite of the way I make gin and tonics.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, because, I put a tall glass like this, ice, gin, and then I wave the tonic bottle over the top. And
they say hello. And
they say hello.
Then they part ways.
That's right. The tonic hits the high road where it belongs.
Right.
So what are we talking about today, my friend, over these Limoncello Collins?
Yeah. We're going to have a second conversation about evangelicals.
Okay.
I went back and listened to our last episode, and there were 4 things that you brought up as sort of, these are the telltale signs of an evangelical from a theological point of view.
Okay.
Number 1 is that their theology is Bible-centric,
Yep.
as the Bible forms the core of their theology, the way they teach it. Number 2, they believe that something significant and important happened on the cross.
Yes.
They don't necessarily spell it out, although different denominations within evangelicalism might spell it out more specifically for what they believe happened. But as an overarching theme, something important happened on the cross. Number 3, some sort of conversion happens in the life, heart, spirit, mind of the Jesus follower, of the Christian.
Yes.
And that's an imperative piece to being an evangelical. That's where you actually begin your evangelical journey.
Exactly
is at
right.
the moment of conversion.
Exactly right.
Whatever that means.
Right.
And then the 4th thing is activism, and that is that faith is lived out. And that is an imperative as well. That if your life isn't bearing fruit, I'll put that in quotes, then are you really a Christian, or are you really an evangelical?
Are you really born again is another way to put it, yeah.
Right, right. And there are some evangelical denominations that lean into that more than others.
Right.
So as I've been thinking about this conversation, I've been really thinking about those 4 things. And I think all 4 of those things basically still apply to my theology today.
Okay.
I consider myself a post-evangelical. That is, that I don't identify with evangelicalism as a movement anymore.
Okay.
And we'll get into what the movement of evangelicalism is these days, because it's changed. But I think there are some core things about evangelicalism that still resonate with me. I still believe that the Bible is an important piece to my theology. I don't know if it is the central piece. When I was growing up, the Bible was upheld as inerrant, that is, flawless, written really by God through people.
Right.
I no longer believe that. So my take on the Bible is that it is a living, breathing book, kind of like our Constitution is supposed to be a living, breathing document.
Right.
And it is to adapt with our culture, it is to adapt with our times. It doesn't mean that it is less true, more true, or whatever. It's just that as we read it through our own lens, wherever we happen to be, I believe, the Holy Spirit still speaks to us through God's Word, wherever we happen to be.
Right, and the way you just phrased that is such an important way of thinking about it. So I just want to highlight that. We can come back to it.
I did have a conversion experience as a kid. I have discounted what that was over the years, but I do believe that it was the beginning of a journey for me. I also don't believe it was the only conversion experience that I've had in the course of my life. I believe there have been many, actually, over the course of my life.
For sure.
But conversion, I think, and commitment, the commitment that happens when you go through whatever that is has been important to me. So I continue to consider that an important piece of my theology.
Okay.
Also, I think that the cross is important. I don't pretend to know what happened, and I don't feel like I have to have that answer. I think that it's enough for me to believe that what Jesus did was an act of servanthood and was also an act of sacrifice, and that we, as followers of Jesus, benefited from the choices that he made that inevitably cost him his life. And what happened after that was clearly supernatural and above my pay grade. And I do believe that it's important that I live my faith. I think that is what Jesus did, and I believe that's what Jesus calls us to. So I think in all four of those ways, I can say that those tenets, those very core tenets of where evangelicalism began, are still important to me and are still an important part of my theology.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, and conversion doesn't have to be, a bright shining moment like the Apostle Paul had, right? It's not like that. In evangelical terms, I would frame it as a conversion of the heart followed by a conversion of the mind.
I like that, yeah.
As opposed to a conversion of the mind followed by a conversion of the heart.
Right.
Right? It's not that you look at it and you go, this all makes rational sense. And now I'm going to wait for it to touch my spirit.
Right.
That's not how it works.
That's not how it works.
At least from an evangelical point of view.
Right.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's all good.
Now, the reason why I consider myself a post-evangelical and no longer a member of that movement is that it has become, in my mind, and pretty objectively so, a political movement.
Yes.
More so than a spiritual movement or a moving of the spirit.
Nice. I like that phrasing.
You know what I mean?
That's right.
And as a political movement, I think it's harmful, damaging, and Antichrist.
Okay. Not to put too fine a point on it. I like you're calling the evangelical movement Antichrist.
Well,
what do you mean by that when you say it?
When I say it, I mean that it actively pursues and promotes causes that are antithetical to what Jesus taught and are antithetical to what Jesus demonstrated.
Perfect.
And they espouse these beliefs strongly, and the means that they use to go about making them the law of the land as a political movement are many times, in my mind, unethical and definitely unchristlike.
Okay, good. I really appreciate your using the word Antichrist to mean anti-Christ, as opposed to some kind of embodied spirit.
Right. No, that's not what I mean.
But it's important, right? Because that notion of an embodied spirit that is the Antichrist is a pretty difficult misreading of the Greek. So I'm glad to hear you talking about it that way.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me. So the political movement itself, as I understand you, what I'm hearing you say is you're paying attention to the fruits of the movement and the methods of the movement and saying that doesn't fit with what the biblical account of Jesus inclines us to believe that he wants.
Exactly.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. 100%.
So one thing that I thought maybe you could help, because you and I've had many conversations about this, but help our listeners understand is how evangelicalism got from what we were talking about in the previous episode to where it is now.
Right. Okay. I think we talked in the previous episode a little bit about how it started with Martin Luther, that whole notion of evangelical, right? The good newsism.
Right.
And then the fundamentalism really started around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century as a response to a perceived threat of Darwinism in science.
Yes.
Okay. Well, so then things kind of quieted down. You had the fundamentalists all off doing fundamentalist things, and evangelicals it was not a big movement in the same way until you started having people who were essentially itinerant preachers, the way that John Wesley was, right?
Yeah.
And there are lots of them we can name, but I would say that the big resurgence of evangelicalism as a movement really came through Billy Graham.
Ah, yeah, okay.
Whether you like Billy Graham or hate Billy Graham, it is my opinion that Billy Graham believed what he said. And that his goal was to create and build a more godly set of people and to assist people in conversion.
Yes.
Kind of midwifey, actually, in a particular way, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like not the one who's actually doing the work, but the one who's making sure that it happens and everything goes okay.
Right.
Like I think that from everything I've heard and read about Billy Graham, his intentions were good.
I believe that too.
Okay. So there was this movement of evangelicalism that happened on a really grassroots kind of way because of these big experiences that Billy Graham had, and because he was a really tremendously good promoter of what he was doing. He was famous and worked the fame and all of those kinds of things. So there was this energy that was happening.
Right.
Well, at the same time, there was this building of energy for Billy Graham. There was also a building of energy for particular versions of liberal. And what I mean by liberal is not like liberalism, like liberal education, but liberal in terms of politically leaning left rather than politically leaning right. Okay. And that was coming out of course, things like the Vietnam War and Roe v. Wade and the Civil Rights Act. Things where it looked like the structure of American life was changing.
Yes.
And the basic foundations, which have never been the Constitution, the basic foundations of daily American life were changing because we were, trying to get marginalized people to the polls. We were, all those kinds of things, right? And of course, you had the responses of the time, and anyway, it kept moving. So you've got all this movement towards a more liberal agenda in the 60s to 70s, and then Jimmy Carter gets elected.
Yes.
Now, Jimmy Carter getting elected was a little bit troubling to evangelicals because he was an evangelical, but he was not a conservative evangelical.
Right.
He was unfortunately kind of a Jesus-y evangelical. He was also not politically loved by the conservatives because he said things like, turn down your temperature.
Yeah.
Save energy. Save the planet. This could be a problem. That kind of stuff. They didn't love that.
Yeah.
And he was sort of, in a way, perceived as anti-capitalist, anti-personal goals, those kinds of things. Now, if you paid any attention, you know that that's not who he was, because obviously he was doing fine. Otherwise, he wouldn't have got elected.
Yeah.
Anyway, point being, was that sort of solidified the deep feelings of the world is shifting too much. There needs to be a response. Okay. And the sense that immorality was rampant. Heaven forbid there was a Catholic who'd been elected president.
Right.
Just all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so in the late 1970s, I don't want to pin a date on it, a group of people got together, and came up with a couple of ideas. One of them was something that we wound up calling, and they wound up calling, the moral majority.
Yes.
Which was a political movement.
Yes.
And another one was a certain kind of conservatism that was brought into primarily the House of Representatives, but also into the Senate, where the goal of it, and this is clearly stated in the documentation of the time, the goal of it was to get Americans to distrust the federal government, which had gained a tremendous amount of power over those years from World War II onward, right? To get Americans to distrust the federal government, which would tend to make them vote to the conservative.
Wow. Okay.
Okay? Flash forward a whole bunch of decades and you can see where that's gotten us.
Yes.
But that being said, because the people who were promoting this would count themselves among evangelicals, and because they would count themselves as moral, and because they were savvy, they framed it in terms of a Christian movement. I don't want to cast aspersions on whether they actually perceived it as Christian.
Okay, yeah.
I want to trust that they felt like it actually was a Christian movement returning to Christian values. I do not, however, believe those values they were trying to get to were Christian values. I think they were wrong in that understanding.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I'm not going to cast any aspersions on their intent.
Okay.
So there was this very, very deliberate political movement tying a particular form of conservatism to Christianity, because then you could talk morality without talking Christianity.
Yeah.
And morality in this case was this sort of nostalgic early 50s Leave It to Beaver that never really existed kind of thing. This allowed that group of people, that political movement, to be anti-woman, anti-abortion as partly a stand-in for not being able to say blacks are bad anymore.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So as that became something you couldn't really talk about, what you could do was come out against effeminate men, against women, against those people taking jobs from Americans.
Yes.
That kind of thing.
Right.
So it became this push towards a model of what it meant to live in a Christian nation, which that alone is fascinating. And it just became more and more political.
Okay.
But it was always meant to be a political movement.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? So when you take the moral majority and the way that the National Association of Evangelicals really developed during that time, it became much more focused on politics and on reclaiming what they believed to be a Christian way of living, which happenstance had them on top.
Sure. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's when this all starts to kind of feed together. Is that kind of very, very smart tying of those things together among people who were uncomfortable with the way that the world was changing.
Yeah.
When people are uncomfortable with the way the world is changing, they look for something that brings them comfort. That's just human.
Sure.
That's where it was.
Well, and this ties into the history of evangelicals pushing against something that they saw as a problem or something they saw as antithetical to what they believed.
Exactly. In some ways, that's not bad, right? I mean, you need counter responses. If something is going radically wrong, you could call the Christians who stood up against Hitler evangelical, right? Living out their faith based in the idea that there was a moral code in Christianity and so forth.
Right.
That's a good thing.
Yes.
Right? So that impulse to live out your faith, which is a standard evangelical view, is not in and of itself a bad thing.
Right.
But like all movements that appeal to something far bigger than we are, whether it's God or the founding fathers, which isn't a real thing, right? It is incredibly tempting to use those things to advance one's own desires.
Right.
And that's pretty much what happened with evangelicalism. Not the political movement of the moral majority and stuff, but evangelicalism went along with it because it promised to return folks who were uncomfortable to the life they thought they were supposed to have and knew.
Yeah.
I think, to be fair, most white folks who are systemically racist don't think in terms of black people bad or brown people bad. But they feel as though what they have is being taken from them.
Yes.
Right? It's that idea that if everybody has some, I have less.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Right? And that particular version of politics played on the idea that if, for example, an immigrant takes a job, that's a job you personally would have had, even if you personally would never have taken that job.
Right. Yeah.
And that builds into that idea that you're being persecuted, which has all kinds of ringing in first century Christianity.
Yeah.
And it puts one in the position of being one of those noble martyrs.
Wow.
Right? And that's just normal human response.
Yeah.
Right? But people far more savvy than I use that very, very well to get what they want.
Yeah.
So evangelicalism became very intertwined with these political movements, partly because they were far better at setting the language, the basis of the debate, and getting people elected and into judgeships and various other forms of power than progressives and liberals have ever been.
Yes, I agree.
So that's where we wound up.
Yeah.
And that's that connection between the two. There's no necessary connection with evangelicals being conservative. There is a connection between evangelicals now being more a political movement than a movement of the heart, because of the way that people have glommed onto it and used it.
Right. Wow. Yeah. And so now you've had some of the political movement now sort of move back into the church as gospel almost. I mean, it's just like it's preached. Some of the things from this political platform are preached just right alongside the words of Jesus, and even taking the words of Jesus and applying them to some of these principles that they have, which are actually things Jesus would not have endorsed.
That's right. I think, although it's a really cynical image, and I think that even most conservatives would say it's a cynical image, that image of Donald Trump with Jesus behind him, comparing Donald Trump as a martyr for his faith, whatever that means, to Jesus as a martyr. There's something about that as cynical as it is, ties in to the Christian myth, not false, bigger, the Christian myth of being against culture, against the way that things are.
Yeah.
It's powerful.
It is powerful. Wow. There's so much more to talk about on this topic.
Yeah, there is.
So I guess we'll have to have a part 3.
Oh, darn. Sorry about that.
Because I'm almost out of my cocktail anyway. Listeners, we love to hear from you. CocktailTheology.com is where we are. Feel free to disagree with us. Feel free to ask us questions. Feel free to give us ideas for episodes and for cocktails.
Especially for,
Till next time, friends.
Bye.
Funny how the view can change, how life just seems to rearrange itself, no matter what it was. I don't know how it goes, but look, moving on feels pretty good. Moving on feels pretty good.
If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like and hit subscribe wherever you're listening right now. We welcome your comments, questions, and ideas for conversations and for cocktails. Please get in touch with us at our website, CocktailTheology.com. Cocktail Theology is a production of SFS. Our theme song is Moving On Feels Pretty Good, recorded by yours truly, Benton Stokes. You can find my music wherever you stream your favorite artists. Join us next Thursday for another new episode.